Hey, welcome back. Today we are talking about HOA Karens. Now, if you don't know what an HOA is, it stands for Homeowners Association. Basically, when you buy a house in certain neighborhoods, you automatically become part of this organization. You pay monthly fees, you follow their rules, and sometimes, someone on that board gets a tiny little bit of power and completely loses their mind. We're talking about people who will fine you $75 for the color of your garden hose, people who will measure your grass with a ruler every single morning, people who have been secretly filming their entire neighborhood for 3 years without telling anyone. These are real stories. They went viral because people couldn't believe that actual human adults were doing these things, and the best part? Every single one of these Karens ends up getting exactly what they deserve. So sit back because we've got 7 stories today. Let's start with chapter 1. So Sarah and her husband had been saving money for 6 years to buy their first home. 6 years. They skipped vacations. They had roommates into their 30s. They did everything right. And when they finally got the keys to their house in Ohio, Sarah actually cried in the driveway. That's how much it meant to her. The moving truck showed up on a Saturday morning. It was barely 9 o'clock, and before the movers had even taken one box off the truck, a woman came marching across the lawn. Polo shirt, khaki pants, sun visor, clipboard. Her name was Diane. She was the HOA president, and she had been waiting for this moment. Diane walked straight up to Sarah, didn't say hello, didn't introduce herself, and handed her a printed piece of paper, a formal violation notice. Already filled out, already signed, with a $75 fine attached. Sarah looked at it, then she looked at the truck, then she looked at Diane. "What exactly did I do?" she asked. Diane pointed to the front left tire of the moving truck. It was parked about 2 inches past the edge of the visitor parking area. 2 inches. And that, according to Diane, was a violation of HOA Parking Code, Section 4, Subsection B. Sarah actually laughed. She thought it was a joke. Diane did not laugh. "Have a great move-in day," Diane said, and walked back to her house across the street. That was day 1. Over the next 30 days, Sarah got 11 more violation notices from Diane. Let me walk you through some of them because they are unbelievable. Violation 2. Sarah's garden hose. It was terracotta colored. Diane said it needed to be HOA approved earth tone green. Fine, $75. Violation 3. Sarah's welcome mat. It was yellow and white, striped, and said hello on it. Diane said the colors were, quote, inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetic standards. Fine, $100. Violation 4. Sarah's porch light was on at 10:47 p.m. The guidelines apparently strongly discouraged lights past 10 p.m. Fine, $50. There were also fines for a recycling bin that was briefly visible from the street, a wind chime that was auditorily intrusive, and, my personal favorite, a potted plant on the front steps that was deemed visually inconsistent with, quote, seasonal planting norms. In early summer, it was just a plant on her steps. Sarah's husband wanted to just pay everything and avoid trouble. Sarah said no. She had a different idea. She requested the complete HOA rulebook, all 84 pages of it, and she sat down and read every single word. Now, most people never read the HOA rulebook. That is exactly what Diane was counting on. But Sarah was not most people. On page 67, she found it. A clause that said, if any board member issues more than 8 violations against the same household within 30 days, without first scheduling a formal hearing, that board member is in violation of the HOA's own rules. The consequence: immediate suspension from the board pending a full review. Sarah had received 12 violations in 28 days. No hearing had ever been offered. Diane had broken her own rules 12 times over. Sarah filed a formal complaint against Diane the very next morning. She printed it, signed it, and personally handed a copy to each of the 4 other board members. The board held an emergency meeting 6 days later. Sarah wasn't even there. She didn't need to be. Diane was removed as HOA president 2 weeks later. All 12 fines were canceled. Sarah received a written apology from the board. The yellow welcome mat is still on her front steps. She bought 3 more just like it, one for each door. And every morning, when Diane pulls out of her driveway across the street, that's the very first thing she sees. Marcus had lived in his house in suburban Austin, Texas for 11 years. Good neighbor. Knew everyone on the street by name. Brought food over when people had babies or lost someone. 0 complaints in 11 years. Then a woman named Linda moved in across the street. Linda was a retired school administrator, and without students to manage anymore, she turned all of that energy toward the neighborhood. She joined the HOA board within 3 weeks of moving in. 2 months later, she had created a brand new committee called the Neighborhood Standards Committee. She was also the only member of this committee because she made it up herself. One Tuesday morning, Marcus was getting ready for work. He glanced out his bedroom window and saw a woman in a floral bathrobe crouching at the edge of his lawn, holding a metal ruler against the grass. She was literally measuring his grass. Marcus went downstairs and opened the front door. "Can I help you?" he called out. Linda stood up and held up the ruler. "Your lawn is 3.7 inches in this section. The limit is 3.5. You'll be receiving a notice." She wrote something on her notepad and walked back home. Marcus just stood there in his work clothes. He had no idea what to say. The fine arrived 2 days later. $125 for a grass height violation. Marcus called a lawn service and had everything cut down to exactly 3 inches. Done. Over. He thought that was the end of it. It was absolutely not the end of it. Over the next 6 weeks, Linda filed 7 more complaints. 3.6 inches, 3.8, 3.9 near the flower bed. Each one came with a fine between $100 and $150. The HOA board, which included Linda, upheld every single one. Now, Marcus is an engineer by profession. And engineers don't just get frustrated, they document things. He bought a professional-grade lawn measurement tool, the same kind that commercial groundskeeping companies use, and every morning at 6:45 a.m. before Linda's bathrobe appeared across the street, he would photograph his lawn from 4 different angles with a time stamp, then take 3 measurements in different spots and write them all down in a log. He did this for 60 consecutive days. Not once did his grass go above 3 inches. On the days when Linda had filed complaints claiming measurements of 3.7, 3.8, 3.9, Marcus had photographs and written records from the same morning showing his lawn, between 2.9 and 3.1 inches. Linda wasn't measuring, she was making numbers up. Marcus put together a 47-page report. Photographs, measurement logs, a timeline, a chart comparing Linda's claimed numbers against his actual documented numbers. He even included a section on the difference in accuracy between a standard metal ruler and a certified professional measuring tool. Very thorough. Very engineer. Silent as he put slide after slide on the table. Photo. Date. Number. Photo. Date. Number. 23 false complaints, laid out one by one. One of the board members, a retired lawyer named Harold, quietly opened the HOA's harassment policy to Section 9. He read it out loud. It said, "Any resident who files 3 or more false complaints against the same neighbor within 90 days is subject to a $500 fine per false complaint." Linda had filed 23 false complaints. Linda owed $11,500. After negotiation, she paid $3,833, every cent of Marcus's previous grass fines. Nearly $1,000 were refunded. Linda's made-up Neighborhood Standards Committee was dissolved. Marcus still mows every Saturday. His professional measuring tool sits on the porch railing where Linda can see it from across the street. He says he's not trying to be petty. He just likes to keep it handy, just in case. This next one is honestly a little creepy, so let me set the scene. There's a neighborhood in suburban Atlanta. Nice place, families, good sidewalks, block parties in the summer. One of those streets where everyone knows everyone. And for 9 years, a woman named Patricia has lived there and served on the HOA board. 6 of those years as vice president. People liked Patricia. She was organized. She always seemed to know what was going on in the neighborhood before anyone else did. Residents figured she just paid close attention. They had no idea how close. So one night at a monthly HOA meeting, a resident named Greg mentions that an Amazon package was stolen from his porch. Patricia immediately offers to help. She says she has a few cameras around her property and would check the footage. Everyone thinks, great, how helpful. Patricia pulls up her laptop right there at the meeting and shows the footage. It's crystal clear. You can see Greg's porch, the delivery driver, and then a car pulling up and someone grabbing the box. The angle is perfect. Almost too perfect. Someone asks where exactly the camera is. Patricia hesitates. One of the other board members checks the video file's metadata. The GPS coordinates of the camera aren't on Patricia's property. They're on the telephone pole at the corner of the street. The room goes very quiet. Over the next 2 weeks, residents started looking around the neighborhood more carefully. What they found was shocking. There were 34 cameras installed across the entire neighborhood, on telephone poles at 3 different intersections, zip-tied to fence posts along the walking path, attached to 2 oak trees in the little park at the center of the street. Each camera was small, weatherproof, and painted or disguised to blend in. People had walked past them every single day for years and never noticed. Patricia had been recording the entire neighborhood for over 3 years. Every driveway, every front door, every mailbox. She had footage of people's daily schedules, when they left, when they came home, who visited them, when deliveries arrived. Hundreds of hours of recorded neighborhood life, and painted or disguised to blend in. People had walked past them every single day for years and never noticed. Patricia had been recording the entire neighborhood for over 3 years. Every driveway, every front door, every mailbox. She had footage of people's daily schedules, when they left, when they came home, who visited them, when deliveries arrived. Hundreds of hours of recorded neighborhood life. But here's the part that really got people. When investigators looked at her home computer, they found folders. 1 folder for each household on the street. Inside each folder, organized by month, then by week. Video clips labeled with dates, times, and handwritten notes. Notes like, leaves with children at 7:14 a.m. or mail visitor, arrives most Thursdays around 6 p.m. She had been building a profile on every single family on the street. When they confronted her at an emergency neighborhood meeting, Patricia didn't apologize. She sat at the table, folded her hands, and said calmly, "I was keeping the neighborhood safe. I did this for this community." Several people got up and walked out to call the police while she was still talking. The legal case took over a year. Patricia's lawyer argued that filming driveways and front porches visible from the street wasn't illegal. The prosecution argued that the secret, systematic, long-term recording, combined with the personal notes tracking people's private routines, went way beyond anything legally acceptable. The judge agreed with the prosecution. Patricia was convicted on 11 counts of unlawful surveillance. She was removed from the board, fined, put on probation, and ordered to destroy every single recording and every piece of equipment. The neighborhood voted to install 2 legitimate, board-approved cameras at the main entrances, clearly marked with signs, visible to everyone. And for reasons nobody has officially put on record, One of those new cameras has a completely clear, unobstructed view of Patricia's driveway. James served 8 years in the U.S. Army, 2 deployments overseas. He came home with a Purple Heart and injuries to his spine and leg that meant he would use a wheelchair for the rest of his life. After years in VA housing and assisted living, James and his wife Angela finally bought their own home. A single-story house in a quiet neighborhood in Raleigh, North Carolina. It was the first home either of them had ever owned. Angela said that when they pulled up on moving day, James just sat in the driveway in his wheelchair and stared at the front door for a long time without saying anything. The house needed one change to be livable for James. One small modification: a wheelchair ramp at the front entrance. The front step was 8 inches high, nothing to most people, but for James, it was a complete barrier. He filed a formal modification request with the HOA board, just like the rules said he had to. He included architectural drawings, a letter from his VA doctor confirming his disability, and a note that the ramp would be built to match the house's materials and color exactly. He submitted it on Tuesday. The board responded on Friday. Denied. The denial letter came from the board president, a woman named Carol Stanton. She cited a rule about not allowing structural additions to the front of any home without unanimous board approval. The vote had been 3-2 against. Carol said the ramp would, quote, negatively impact the visual consistency of the streetscape. Visual consistency of the streetscape for a wheelchair ramp for a disabled veteran. And then, and this is the part that really made people angry, attached to the denial was a separate notice. If James built the ramp without approval, he would be fined $10,000 up front, plus $250 every single day until it was removed. James read that letter twice. Then he called his contractor and told him to start building. And then he called an old friend from his unit who had become a journalist. The ramp was finished on Thursday. The story ran on Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, 3 national news outlets had picked it up. By Friday evening, it was trending online. The headline was simple: Disabled combat veteran denied wheelchair ramp by HOA, threatened with $10,000 fine. Legal experts were on the news within hours. Every single one of them said the same thing. The Fair Housing Act is a federal law that requires housing associations to allow reasonable disability modifications. Refusing a wheelchair ramp for someone in a wheelchair is not a gray area. It's a clear federal violation. Carol Stanton had made a catastrophic mistake, and the entire country now knew about it. By Saturday, the HOA's own lawyer had called Carol privately to explain the situation. By Monday, Carol had resigned. By Wednesday, the new board had issued a public apology, voided every fine, and voted unanimously to not only approve the ramp but to pay for a full professional upgrade out of the HOA's reserve fund. The upgraded ramp was installed 2 weeks later. Wider than the original plan, non-slip surface, handrails on both sides. The contractor did the work at cost after hearing the story. James received over 400 letters and emails from veterans around the country. A veterans advocacy group in Washington, D.C. used his case in testimony before Congress the following year. Carol's committee was dissolved by a neighborhood vote 2 months later. Every vote against her was unanimous. James still lives in that house. Angela says every morning when he wheels out the front door, he pauses at the top of the ramp for just a moment and looks out at the neighborhood before heading down. She says he looks like exactly what he is, someone who earned the right to be there. Okay, this one might be my favorite, because it starts with one of the pettiest complaints I've ever heard, and it ends with the most satisfying possible outcome. Carlos and Maria Rivera had been decorating their home every December for 15 years. And over those 15 years, the display had grown into something truly special. Thousands of lights on the roofline and bushes. A lit-up sleigh and reindeer on the front lawn. Candy cane path lights. A a projector casting animated snowflakes on the garage door, and a handmade wooden nativity scene that Carlos built himself and repainted every few years. The neighborhood loved it. Parents would bring little kids just to walk past the house and see it. A local Facebook group had a whole thread every year where people shared photos. One year, a couple got engaged in front of it. Carlos and Maria have that couple's photo on their refrigerator to this day. Then their new neighbor, Brenda, moved in, and Brenda had opinions. Within 4 days of Carlos plugging in the lights, Brenda filed her first complaint. It was a noise complaint. A noise complaint about lights, Christmas lights, which make no noise. The city sent an inspector. The inspector came, looked at the lights, confirmed they made no sound, and closed the complaint. That took about 20 minutes. 3 days later, Brenda filed a light pollution report with the city's environmental department. The city reviewed it, determined the display was well within every applicable standard, and dismissed it. Then Brenda filed a complaint with the county, not the city, the county, claiming the electrical setup was a fire hazard. A county inspector came out, checked everything, found it completely safe, and dismissed it. Then, and I want you to really absorb this, Brenda wrote a formal letter to the State Energy Commission, claiming that the Rivera family's Christmas lights were a significant and willful misuse of electrical energy that required regulatory review. The State Energy Commission replied that it had no power over individual residential holiday decorations and suggested she call her local utility if she was worried about her own bill. 4 complaints, 4 different government agencies, all dismissed. Every single one. But each dismissal still required the Riveras to respond, schedule inspectors, fill out forms, and spend hours of their own time just proving that their Christmas lights were just Christmas lights. Carlos wanted to scale things back. He's a quiet guy, he doesn't like trouble. Maria said no. We have done nothing wrong, Maria told him. Nothing. And I am not going to apologize for Christmas. The following December, the Rivera family did not scale back. They upgraded. With help from their 3 kids and 2 neighbors who volunteered, they put up 40,000 lights, double the year before. They hired someone to program a full light show synchronized to music, broadcast on a low-power FM frequency so people could hear it from their cars. They set up a donation box for the local children's hospital at the edge of the lawn. They ran the display until 10 p.m. on weekdays and 11 p.m. on weekends. Cars were lined up around the block every single night for 3 weeks. The local news came out and did a story, specifically mentioning that a neighbor had tried to shut the display down the year before. That story spread online. The Children's Hospital donation box collected over $8,000 by Christmas Eve. The house was added to a regional holiday homes tour. The same city whose inspectors had dismissed Brenda's complaints 12 months earlier sent the Riveras a certificate of recognition. Brenda's decorations that year, 1 artificial wreath on the front door. It fell off in a windstorm in early January. She didn't replace it. The Riveras still do the display every December. It keeps getting bigger every year. Carlos has started teaching his grandchildren how to help set it up. Maria says she cries every time they turn the lights on for the first time each season. Tom spent 38 years as a carpenter, the kind who builds custom furniture that ends up in beautiful homes. He retired at 64 with bad knees and a woodworking shop in his garage. And he had 2 great loves in life, building things and birds. Tom could identify over 60 bird species just by looking at them, and another 20 by their call alone. He had feeders in his backyard, a bird bath, and a section of his garden planted specifically with native plants to attract migratory species. Sometimes his neighbors would catch him standing completely still in his yard with binoculars around his neck, just watching a branch. In late spring, Tom decided to build a birdhouse, a simple nesting box for bluebirds, which he'd been trying to attract for 2 seasons. He spent 3 weekends on it, 12 inches tall, cedar wood, a perfectly sized entry hole for bluebirds, painted a muted sage green to match his fence, He hung it in the back corner of his garden where you could barely see it from the street. His neighbor Harold came over, looked at it, and said it was the finest birdhouse he had ever seen in person. A female bluebird showed up 11 days later. 2 weeks after that, Tom got a cease and desist letter in the mail. It was from Rhonda Pierce, chairwoman of the HOA Architectural Review Committee. The letter said Tom had erected an unauthorized structure in violation of HOA Community Standard 7.4. He had 14 days to remove it or face a $200 fine that would go up $50 every additional day. Tom called Rhonda directly. "What rule does a 12-inch birdhouse violate?" he asked. "It's an unauthorized installation," Rhonda said. "It's a birdhouse. It weighs 4 pounds. All outdoor structures require committee review. You should have submitted a request." "I need to submit a request," Tom said, "for a birdhouse." "That's the process," Rhonda said, and hung up. Tom got out the HOA rulebook and found Community Standard 7.4, the rule Rhonda had cited. He read the whole thing. Then he read the definitions section. Then he read the exemptions section in the back, and right there in Appendix C, he found it. A list of items that are completely exempt from architectural review. One of the exemptions read, "Items measuring fewer than 18 inches in any single dimension. Used for wildlife habitat, gardening, or horticultural purposes, are not subject to Standard 7.4, 12 inches tall. Used for wildlife habitat. Fully exempt." The HOA's own rules said so in writing in the back of the book. Tom paid $400 for a 1-hour consultation with an HOA lawyer, who confirmed his reading in about 15 minutes. The lawyer also pointed out something extra. The HOA's bylaws had a fee-shifting clause. If a resident successfully defended against an HOA action that was found to have no legal merit, the HOA had to pay back that resident's legal fees. Tom sent a formal response to Rhonda, quoting the exemption word for word, and letting her know that the birdhouse was staying up and that he expected his legal fees to be reimbursed if this went any further. Rhonda escalated to mediation. The mediation session lasted 40 minutes. Tom brought his lawyer and a highlighted copy of the rulebook. He also brought a photograph of the bluebird that had moved in. The HOA's own attorney, separately hired and paid for by the HOA fund, reviewed the exemption language during the session, set down his pen, and told Rhonda directly, "We don't have a case here." The mediation ended with a formal finding that Rhonda's enforcement action had no legal basis. The HOA reimbursed Tom's $400 within 30 days. The Architectural Review Committee was restructured, and new guidelines were issued explicitly listing birdhouses as exempt, something that should have been clear from the beginning. Tom built 4 more birdhouses that summer and gave them to his neighbors as gifts. Every house on his street has one now, except one. Rhonda's yard remains, as far as anyone knows, birdhouse-free. The original bluebird came back the following spring and raised a second brood. Tom has the photos framed in his workshop. Okay, this is the big one. Save the best for last, right? This story has everything: power, control, greed, and one very calm accountant who quietly took the whole thing apart. Margaret had been HOA president of Stonegate Commons in Sarasota, Florida, for 5 years. And in those 5 years, she had made herself completely untouchable. She fined people for cracked driveways, dim porch lights, and substandard landscaping, a term she had added to the rules herself with no definition of what it actually meant. She passed dues increases of 4 to 7% every single year, always citing rising costs. She had removed 2 board members who questioned her decisions. She had made the HOA so complicated and so exhausting to deal with that most people just stopped fighting and paid whatever she asked. If you've ever lived somewhere with a bad HOA, you know the type. She had turned the monthly meetings into one-person shows. She controlled everything: the agenda, the finances, who got to speak, and for how long. And then David Park moved in. David was 41 years old, quiet, organized, and he had spent 16 years as a forensic accountant. The kind of person that companies hire when they suspect someone has been stealing from them. He had seen fraud at organizations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He knew what it looked like before anyone even said the word. His first hint that something was off came from his third fine notice in 60 days. The first two he had paid without question, one for a faded house number, one for a small oil stain he quickly cleaned. The third fine was for a fence post he had replaced. He had replaced it identically to the original, because it had rotted. Same height, same wood, same paint color. Margaret's notice called it an unapproved structural modification. The fine was $350. David didn't pay it. He submitted a formal records request for 5 years of HOA financial statements, bank records, vendor contracts, and board meeting minutes. Under Florida law, the HOA had to provide these within 10 business days. Margaret took 3 weeks. David noted the delay but stayed quiet. When the records arrived, they came in 4 huge binders with no index, no organization, completely out of order. David was pretty sure this was intentional. He indexed everything himself. It took 3 evenings. What he found was not subtle at all. Over 5 years, Margaret had authorized $139,400 in payments to a landscaping company called Prestige Property Services. The payments were consistent, and they grew every year, right alongside the dues increases she kept pushing through. David looked up Prestige Property Services in the Florida Business Registry. It was a single-person LLC. The registered owner was a man named Gerald Thorne. Gerald Thorne was Margaret's brother-in-law. David then looked for evidence of competitive bidding, which is standard practice for any significant HOA contract, and required by Stonegate Commons' own rules for anything above $5,000. There was no record of any competitive bid, ever, for the Prestige contract. No comparison of rates from other companies. No vote by the board to approve the contract. Not one recorded vote in 5 years. Margaret had been directing community money to her family member's company exclusively, without bids, without board approval, for 5 consecutive years. And she had been doing it while raising everyone's dues to cover the costs. $139,400. Quietly, year after year after year. David spent 2 more weeks building his presentation. He checked every number twice. He prepared a 60-slide deck with every transaction documented and every source cited. He requested a slot at the next HOA meeting. Margaret's assistant said the agenda was full. David replied that he was exercising his legal right as a resident to address the board on a financial matter, a right guaranteed under Florida law that cannot be denied. He got his slot. On the night of the meeting, 61 of the 93 households in the community sent someone. It was the highest attendance the neighborhood had ever seen. Word had gotten out that something was happening. David presented for 40 minutes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't use dramatic language. He just walked through the numbers, slide by slide. The vendor, the payments, the family connection, the missing bids, the missing votes, the total amount. Margaret sat at the head of the table the entire time and did not say one word. When David finished, one of the other board members immediately moved to remove Margaret from the presidency and launch an independent audit. The vote was 4-1. The one person who voted against removal was Margaret herself. She was removed from office that night by her own board. A criminal referral was filed with the county the following week. A full independent audit confirmed everything David had found. Prestige Property Services had also been charging the HOA about 40% above market rate for years, meaning the community had been overcharged on top of the money being funneled to family. Margaret was charged with misappropriation of funds, breach of fiduciary duty, and filing false financial certifications. Her brother-in-law faced separate charges. She was convicted. She was ordered to repay the full $139,400 plus $28,000 in legal and investigation costs. She is banned from serving on any HOA board in Florida for life. The community hired a new landscaping company through a proper competitive bidding process. The winning bid came in 38% lower than what Prestige had been charging. Annual dues were reduced by 31% the following year, the first reduction in the neighborhood's history. David became the HOA treasurer. He publishes a complete financial breakdown on the neighborhood website every single month. Every transaction, every vendor, every dollar in and out, voluntarily and without being asked. And that $350 fine for the fence post? Voided, refunded, and accompanied by a written apology from the new board. David keeps the apology letter framed in his office, not because he holds a grudge. He says it just reminds him that sometimes one person paying close attention is all it takes.